I welcome you to my home. Do come in, have a seat. I have something here to relax you. I think you'll find it quite a treat. If you find me sounding insane, it's just the absence of talking. It's just the
Welcome back to another episode of It At. I'd like to start this video by thanking our two Patreon subscribers, E. Woak and Hans Adorf. Thank you guys very much for doing that. That means a great deal to me personally to know that there are folks out there that appreciate what we're doing and want to support it to that degree. So thank you, gentlemen. So in a previous take of this video, I was actually starting it as a subscriber Q&A with Hans Adorf, actually, in regards to a comment thread that we had that was talking about inner city transport and some of the ways that we're going to have to address that in the future. But as I was doing the video, what I was discovering was that there was enough unique material in this that I felt that that it would do more of a service to address the inner city question in a later video. I believe it really does deserve a video of its own, and so we're going to go ahead and keep this one as it is, just relating to California's high-speed rail mostly. But that left me wondering how I was going to categorize this video, what I was going to call it, frankly. But the character of the video really has a lot more to do with how to mismanage a project than it does with the California rail specifically. And we'll kind of go into that a little bit about the various ways that the California project kind of went astray. And so let's go ahead and start off with that theme by taking a quick look at this. Now, this is Germany's Brandenburg airport. Now, the idea for this, as the idea is that you'll see the common theme here for any major project, they're all well-founded. The idea for the Brandenburg airport actually dates back to the fall of the Berlin Wall. This area had 3 airports, and the idea was then to combine them all into one major airport, and that made perfect sense, even the way that they chose the site for it, basically by sliding the location of one current airport further down so that then you could utilize the runways for that airport. Great, wonderful planning. I thought that was a great thing when I was looking at that initially. And then it all went pear-shaped. Now, it started to go downhill when I don't believe they really put this out for a proper bid when they were looking at how to design the building, its architecture. I think that they decided that they wanted to go with somebody more or less local that they knew and respected, and instead of maybe putting it out to a more global bid, they went with somebody that they liked. Well, the problem with that turned out to be that the architect didn't feel that airports should have shops in them. And again, that was a personal decision of his own, but it didn't get caught until actually they had finished building the airport. And then all of a sudden they're scrambling to try and figure out how to put shop space in it. The gentleman felt that an airport was like a bus station or a train station, that the idea was that you go there and you get on your plane and you leave. And I left me wondering whether this guy had ever flown. Generally, airports, they're places of waiting, really, especially now with all of the security protocols that we have to go through to get on a flight. And so that's something that obviously wasn't addressed in his case. So they had to do a little bit of interior redesign. Well, that turned out to be the least of their problems, because whether in a spirit of corporate nepotism or what, the company that they hired to actually build the building either didn't do the load calculations or did them incorrectly. Maybe they weren't even qualified to do them because they made the roof too heavy for the supporting structure. And before anybody could go in to fix the shops, the first thing they had to try and figure out what they were going to do was keep the building from falling over. Well, at some point along this path, you would think that it would be best to just knock it down and start over. Well, that time came yet again when, after they finished doing all of the structural modifications that they need to, they installed a fire suppression system, and unfortunately they again chose a company, for whatever reason, to do this fire suppression system that had never actually installed a fire suppression system before. And the result of that was that they thought it was a great idea to put the smoke evacuation system in the basement. Well, I think everybody can figure out what's wrong with that. You get even a minor fire, and now you're going to go ahead and kill everybody with smoke inhalation by sucking all the fumes, all the smoke, down to the ground level while everybody's trying to get out. So, again, we get back to that. At some point, you should probably just knock it down and start over. But that becomes then political suicide for all of the people that had supported it for what is now probably far too long. Well, they started building this thing in 2006. It was supposed to be finished in 2012. It is now 2020, and they're saying that, oh, well, it's supposed to open in October, but, with the virus thing that we have, maybe we'll be a little delayed. So I don't know, I'll maybe have to do a follow-up video to this and discuss the project specifically. But we're not actually here to talk about the Brandenburg airport. We're trying to look at what are some of the parallels that we might learn from that are now being applied to the California high-speed rail system. So, like the Brandenburg airport, the high-speed rail system was a great idea when it was first conceived. And again, the conception of this went way back. This was not just a 2006 thing, which is kind of what they were, where we really started to see the first funding formed for it. By 2012, they had a pretty good idea of where they wanted to build it, and then they wound up fully funding and breaking ground in 2016, I think it was. So the problem with the high-speed rail was primarily one of NIMBYism. NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. And though there was an understanding that this thing needed to be operating in a high-speed corridor between San Francisco and LA, the problem then became, oh, shoot, how do you get it there? And what you'll see in this map, let's go ahead and pull this big map up. This is the system in its entirety, about a little over 800 miles of the of track for it. And what you'll see here is that they make a little jog over to Sacramento, and then they're going down Highway 99, basically, using an established corridor down what's called the Central Valley in California. And then they're going to do that to get down to the LA area. Well, okay. Great. So they're basing the cost models on this thing around a study that they did that showed that expected ridership for this high-speed rail was going to be around 28 million riders a year. And the interesting thing there is that when you start to look at the round trips from San Francisco to LA, you see that the air travel is in kind of the 6 to 8 million a year range. And so this high-speed rail system is designed primarily to compete with vehicle traffic. It's not really trying to solve your air traffic problem. And so if you look at it in regards to the problem that it's actually trying to solve, then things become fairly clear. You're trying to basically relieve congestion at the two end areas, at San Francisco and at LA, to relieve the traffic there. And you're trying to obviously remove pollution. And okay, let's set those as our goals. That's great. Well, the price tag when they were first looking at building it was $20 billion. Whew, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. But at the time, we choked it down. It's fine. It is what it is. It's a very major project. It's, we understand that, that it's got a lot of hurdles. Again, they had to move it to where it was in the Central Valley down 99 because that was where they could afford to purchase the land. And the purchase price is really only part of it. The idea of trying to put a high-speed rail from, say, San Francisco to Carmel, you can't imagine the number of lawsuits that would be thrown your way for you to try and pull something like that off. And so, unfortunately, that leaves you in a situation of you're not really looking at a train that will have a lot of stops along the way where people actually want to go to. And that's okay because, the U.S. rail system, as it went from coast to coast, when it went to an area, that area then became a special economic zone. We'll use that term again later in the video. And entire towns sprung up along the rail routes. And so one can see that has the potential for happening again in this case as they take a little bit off the beaten path route to get from San Francisco to LA. So that's not a complete disaster. But the money, it went from $20 billion to $35 billion to $40 billion. And what prompted this video was when I just looked at their recent report for this past year, and now their cost estimate is $63 billion on the low end, possibly as high as $90 billion, billion with a B. Well, at that point, I decided I need a drink and a calculator. So here we go. Let's pull up this route again. So you see this route, and that represents, again, like I said, 800 miles or so of rail needs to go in. I started to do a little quick math, and it's always interesting to me to be able to relate what dollars mean in reality. And sometimes it's very difficult, but one thing that snapped into my head right away that I thought was kind of clever was I got curious. How many Tesla Model Ys could you buy for $63 billion? So we start with $1 billion. And at 15 feet and $50,000, $1 billion comes out to be just shy of 60 miles. So you could pave this entire route, all 800 miles, both ways with Tesla Model Ys and still have 2,100 miles of Tesla Model Ys left over. So this brings us to the thought experiment that I want us to go through for this video as we try and compare high-speed rail to autonomous vehicles. Back to the Brandenburg airport. At some point, what you're trying to accomplish can either no longer be accomplished through the path that you are pursuing, or you wind up having an avenue open up to you that you never realized before that would cost you far less but accomplish the exact same thing or close to the exact same thing. So take a look at those ridership numbers. Now, you have an expected ridership of 28 million people going on your transport system. Let's go ahead and just call it that, since we're now dealing with two competing systems. And let's take a look at this hypothetical autonomous driving network. If you live anywhere along any of these corridors, anywhere close, an autonomous vehicle can drive from where it is stationed to where you are, pick you up, and in moments you'll be back on the freeway at 120 or 130 miles an hour. I'll talk later in the video about why I've kind of chosen that number. And every vehicle in the entire line paving the entire route moves forward 15 feet and fills itself in. Now, obviously, that's absurd, but this is a thought experiment. I want you to start thinking in terms of that, and that being how to spread a load across a system so that you're not trying to charge all the cars in one place, that you have it spread across your system. Now, realistically, if we were to go with a autonomous vehicle route, what you would wind up having is pockets of these vehicles that were stored where they needed to be to backfill the system. But for now, let's just go ahead and think of it in terms of what we're looking at. You've got cars all the way up and down the route. The ridership, 28 million a year, that roughly comes out to having, if you had an occupancy of 2 or 3 people per vehicle, you'd wind up having to have roughly 4,000 vehicles on one end, 4,000 vehicles on the other, and then each of them would make a trip. Now again, back to that whole thing. Is everybody going to be leaving at the same time? No, probably not. But the idea then becomes, how much does that cost? If you put 8,000 Teslas in that network, in that system, that would be $500 million. That leaves a whole lot of extra money for concrete and paint, if that is what you're trying to solve. In other words, if you understand that you're not necessarily trying to remove vehicles from the road, what you're trying to do is you're trying to alleviate congestion at either end, and you're trying to eliminate pollution. So if you have a rail system, one of the main things that hurts ridership in a rail system is convenience. Convenience is king. You want to be able to easily get to the transportation hub and then have that take you to where you want to go. My videographer that you've met sometimes through some of these videos, Edmund, he loves to take the train. He'll come up from Southern California, but it's a bit of a hassle for him. He's got to get to the train station in LA, and then once he gets up here, I have to actually go to either Stockton or Sacramento to pick him up. Oh, and Sacramento, by the way, he has to take a bus from Stockton to Sacramento. And so that's why most commonly I'll actually go down to Stockton to pick him up. So convenience is king if you're going to wind up having a sustainable ridership. Well, that also leads you to the situation where the train leaves when it leaves. It's going to be on a schedule, which means that you have to get to the train station on time. Now, you don't have the security issues that you have obviously with an airplane, and we'll also go ahead and give the rail system the benefit of the doubt and say that you don't need a ticket before you get there, that you can actually purchase a ticket and then go, so that would add to the convenience. But it doesn't do anything to alleviate the congestion on either end of the system, because once the train gets there, you have roughly 1,000 people now that have to get off of the train. And then through a combination of either local light rail or busing or taxis that are in the area, you then have to then get to your final destination. When you compare that to an autonomous vehicle solution, you wind up then seeing the convenience of having that vehicle come to where you are and then take you to your final destination. You take your bags from your home out to the curb, load them into the vehicle, and then off you go. So that, to me, it's a huge benefit to, again, increasing that ridership, possibly even beyond what they're projecting for the light rail. I would love the idea of hopping in a autonomous vehicle that had an interior, again, like a rail car. So let's pull up a montage real quick of what some of these vehicles might look like. So you're not looking at necessarily a Model Y that comes by to get you. You're looking at something that's more like this. If you have kids and you want to go to Disneyland, say, you could even do it in two vehicles, where you would wind up having the adults in the vehicle with the bar car and the kids back in the other vehicle where they can watch movies and play video games and what have you. And then because communications is what it is here in the 21st century, you're never out of communication with the kids in the other car. If they need to stop to relieve themselves, or if they need a bite to eat, they can simply communicate with the other vehicle, and then that vehicle can pull off. And then that brings us back to the idea of those special economic zones. Well, along the route, you can actually build areas to pull off. And these areas would take the form of what I refer to as long towns, a town that's actually built over a course of about a half of a mile or so over the top of the existing roadway. And you have an elevated structure because these vehicles are driving in roughly the fast lanes of what is the highway. Then they would wind up pulling off to the center of the road and then being able to have plenty of time to slow down in this long town. And then the towns would have shops, places to eat, rest, and also possibly areas to charge the vehicles and maintain the vehicles if needed, if the vehicle had a problem along the way that it could manage until it got to one of these long towns, something like low tire pressure or something of that nature, where there was a warning in the vehicle. But also it would have access to the local area. If you notice that you're going to be driving by an aviation museum or something of that nature, then you could have the vehicle pull off, and then because it's accessed through surface street feeders, then you'd be able to then see what the local area had to offer. So I think that would be incredibly convenient on that level. Then it also opens up this other idea that you're now not limited to these existing corridors. You're not limited to having to go down Highway 99 and build an entire new set of track simply because that was where you were able to purchase the land. Now, because it is a lane that you've built, or more to the point, 2 lanes and enough room for a bypass, right? So you are going to have to sacrifice the fast lanes and maybe a bit of the center of the roadway. And so in a lot of places that'll leave you with 2 lanes or even 1 lane in either direction to handle local traffic. But the ridership for using these systems will likely be high enough that it will alleviate the traffic in and around the local areas, and so it'll probably be a wash. But back to the idea there about no longer being limited to what we see here, where you're going someplace nobody really wants to go to. Now you have opened up areas like Monterey and Carmel and San Luis Obispo and all of these areas that are along the way on Highway 101, and I'll show these 3 roadways here. That's a good thing to pull up so that you get an idea on what we're talking about. Now, Highway 99, as I said, it goes through the California Central Valley, and it goes through a lot of agricultural areas. And so each of these 3 corridors that we're going to examine, Highway 99, Highway 101, and Highway 5 in the center, we're going to see different types of traffic that generally use these 3 corridors. Now on Highway 99, again, agricultural area, you see a lot of horse trailers, you see some larger recreational vehicles, a lot of fifth wheels, and so it tends to be that type of traffic. When you get to I-5, you also see a lot of recreational vehicles, a lot of truck traffic, because this is basically a straight shot without a lot of elevation changes or turns, and so it tends to be a highly trafficked corridor for commerce, for getting goods from one place to another. And then on the coast, you have Highway 101, and then in some places Highway 1, where the two actually become the same road. It's an entirely different animal. Highway 101 has some sections that would be fast enough to feed a high-speed autonomous vehicle network, but other areas where they probably have to slow down. And so that presents a challenge, obviously, if you're going to do that. But you've now divided all of that vehicle traffic into those three different corridors. And so if your idea is getting from Northern California to Southern California as quick as possible, you'll be using a high-speed corridor, possibly down I-5, and not using Highway 101 at all. But if you want to take a leisurely trip down, just as you would do if you were choosing to drive on Highway 101, then you would do so with the idea that you were then going to stop at some of these areas along the way. And so I think that the convenience of the whole thing really does help us fold in that type of reality where that's where your competition is really coming from. So let's go ahead and talk about speed. So the main selling point for the high-speed rail has been that they're claiming that you'll be able to go from San Francisco to LA in about 2 hours and 40 minutes. And that's pretty good. That's relaxing. It's high speed. It's comfort. If you want something to eat, you go to the dining car. If you want something to drink, you go to the bar car. Very comfortable. The problem then again becomes getting to the train on time and then getting out. In a very similar situation that you have with airport traffic. If you are going to fly, the flight from San Francisco to LA is only about 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. But getting to and out of that airport is an absolute nightmare. And so ultimately, it's going to take you 3-4 hours to make that 45-minute flight, if you're lucky. That's with no kids and basically a carry-on bag. As you start to add more things that might slow you down, then you wind up having to plan for even greater amounts of time on either end. And that is why people tend to drive that route. Because by the time you get to the airport and the plane is actually wheels up, if you had just gotten in your car in San Francisco and started driving, you'd be in Monterey by the time that aircraft was wheels up. And taking Highway 101. You can then cross over and go to a faster route to try and speed up your trip. And so a trip that would take you 3 hours, maybe 4 hours in an airplane takes you 6 hours or so, 6.5 hours in a car if you were to drive. And that's at normal freeway speeds that we have today, right now. So when we start to look at things like an autonomous high-speed lane, where you wind up being able to increase the speeds, then you wind up having a slightly different conversation when you're comparing it to something like air travel or even high-speed rail. The high-speed rail, again, as we discussed, it can remain fairly efficient as long as you don't stop it. And along the way, along the high-speed rail, you're probably going to wind up having a couple of places where you stop it. But again, it doesn't really go to where any place you'd want to stop along the way anyway, and so that by default alleviates part of that discussion. But how much faster is it really? So when we talk about high speed, it's possible to have a train that exceeds 300 miles an hour. Here's a train going 350 miles an hour, and this is what that looks like. So who thinks that was a great idea? Germany had a intra-city rail system, the ICE, the intercity express, I think was what it stood for, and it didn't run anywhere near 300 miles an hour. And they had a terrible crash near Eschede, Germany in 1998, where they had a wheel come apart on one of the carriages, and it wound up accordioning underneath the overpass, killed 100 or so people on the train, 4 people on the ground, injured severely 100 others. And that train was only going 125 miles an hour when it had its unfortunate accident. So when you're talking about high-speed rail, things go great when they're going great, but when they go wrong, they tend to go terribly wrong. We just recently, within the last few years or so, we had a case of a Chinese high-speed rail train slam into the back of another high-speed rail train, and so that was very unfortunate there. But the point there is that because we have broken up the train, we're now not transporting everybody all at once. We're sending them in individual vehicles, and they may chain up together to get through certain points, and you may wind up having several vehicles fairly close together. I can see that would certainly be the case. But in the case of something even terrible or catastrophic happening, where you wind up having, say, a vehicle come off of an overpass and landing actually in what I am imagining would be a semi-enclosed high-speed autonomous vehicle lane, because you don't want other traffic to be able to turn into those lanes at all. But say you had something land there from an overpass that was too close for the other vehicle to stop, and you had a tragic accident that even resulted in some loss of life. It's just one car. And again, the loss of any life, obviously, that's tragic. But it's certainly not the case that you wind up losing an entire train in a high-speed derailment, something of that nature. And so that allowance is something that would then allow the system to evolve over time and make small incremental safety improvements. The biggest safety issue that I can see with such a system would be debris in that had gotten into these contained lanes. Anything that comes off of one of these cars, if you get a flat tire or something of that nature, it'll probably likely remain in the lane. And so those are things that will have to be addressed as the system matures. But again, back to that whole point of safety. I'm not trying to say that high-speed rail is unsafe. It certainly is not. I'm not trying to say that aviation is unsafe. It certainly is a very safe way to travel. And so that sets the bar very high for these autonomous vehicles. If you're going to claim that this is a total solution to this, then it's going to have to hold its end up. It's actually going to have to show that it's capable of doing that. Now, the last thing that we'll address here is a bit of the shared costs of this entire network. We talked a little bit about how many Tesla Model Ys that $63 billion would buy. But the reality is not only do you not need anywhere near that many vehicles to be able to service a network that would even cover all 3 of those transit corridors between San Francisco and San Diego, but you also then wind up having the ability to share those costs, because it isn't just Tesla that's going to be making these autonomous vehicles that would then be approved for use on these high-speed vehicle lanes. And then also, obviously, we're talking about having routes within cities that would be designated early on as autonomous vehicle only routes so that they could get to local neighborhoods to pick up passengers. But Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen, Toyota, everybody is going to be making autonomous vehicles because ultimately they're going to be safer. And after a time, there are going to be areas, again, getting back to some of the conversations that Hans Adorf and myself have been having, there are going to be entire areas within cities where humans just simply won't be allowed to drive. Just too dangerous. You want to make it so that you can open up more of these urban areas, turn more of it into parks, and be able to free up some of the space. You don't want to have the risk of vehicles running into pedestrian traffic. You're going to want to create situations where you actually foster pedestrian traffic within cities. And again, we'll discuss that in a separate video about the many forms that might take. But instead of having to then focus all of this money on purchasing the vehicles for the system, you can then transfer some of those funds into programs that will allow other automobile companies to comply to the standards that you set for these high-speed vehicle lanes. And at that point, you start to realize that if you're running a train in that kind of a 200 to 180 to 250 mile an hour range for speed, that the competition that you have now, if you're allowing these cars to drive at 120 or 130 miles an hour, the time difference really now is negligible, especially when you factor in that if you don't live near a high-speed rail station, that you would then have to travel potentially quite a distance, and then that distance has limits. When you look at that map, you've got that corridor that goes from San Francisco to Sacramento over then to Highway 99 and then down the Central Valley. What if you live in Monterey? You have to then drive all the way to, or take a cab, or somehow you have to get to San Francisco, which is going to be your nearest rail station. San Jose isn't really much better, whereas you have to fight traffic to even just get far enough north to get to someplace where there is a station. And remember what we talked before, they're not going to stop the thing all the time. So where are these stations going to be along the way where the trains are actually going to stop to pick up passengers? So when you start to factor in things like convenience and actual time of travel, and the fact that a autonomous vehicle just fits your lifestyle, it fits the style in which people are already traveling from LA to San Francisco or San Diego. Now all you have to do is say, okay, well, if we can make that autonomous vehicle look like a rail car and have the same creature comforts, can I sleep? Can I have a scotch? Can I, get something to eat? Then the reality of this becomes more clear. And so then we'll close out now with just that as a thought, that when you're looking at these types of large projects, that what's really critical is never lose sight of the problems that you're actually trying to solve. And at some point, be willing to accept the fact that you have spent enough money on what it is that you're doing that's going in the wrong direction, that it is actually okay to stop spending any more money and then shift your idea over to a better solution. The autonomous vehicle solution did not exist when they were planning California's high-speed rail, but it exists now. And when we're being faced with somebody telling us that it's going to be on the short end $63 billion to complete this system, potentially even much more than that, stop. And so if any of you have the ear of your representatives here in California, let's go ahead and band together and see if we can maybe get them to stop this nonsense and maybe examine some other solutions to this. The good news, I suppose, is that as I was looking at what is built already with California's high-speed rail, you actually do see the potential of just don't put train tracks there. Make it a high-speed vehicle travel corridor in either direction where you were going to build the tracks, and then just transfer everything that's left back over to the existing corridors of Highway 99, or where you need to if you feel that there are areas that would really benefit from some kind of a bypass entirely of a section of Highway 9, then certainly continue to build a track-like structure that will get you past that bottleneck. That is certainly also something that's viable. So at any rate, I hope you found that to be a fun little thought exercise when we start to take a look at what you could do with that money other than what they're currently doing with it. And for Hans Adorf and all the rest of our folk watching from Germany, my heart goes out. I really hope that they're able to get the Brandenburg airport open in October as they would like to. I'd love to see some of your comments about what you feel about that locally. That was a fun thing to kind of come across as I was doing some research for this video. But we've let this thing run on long enough, so thank you for joining us, and we will see you again very soon.
Thank you.